Hello, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be welcoming you to Volt's second roundtable on systemic racism. My name is Kim Smouter. I am a member of Volt Belgium, and it is my great pleasure to be hosting this roundtable. And I am joined by some fantastic panelists who will be helping us to essentially explore how systemic racism is being experienced across Europe, and particularly looking at the systemic racism topic from a more political perspective. So if you didn't join us for the first roundtable, I invite you to take a look at it. In that particular roundtable, we spoke with the panelists about the personal experience and the personal impact that racism has on the individuals. We were very keen to begin this topic by looking at the personal, because racism in and of itself, in essence, is discrimination against persons, is discrimination against individuals. So we were quite interested in that first roundtable to really begin talking about this topic from a very personal perspective, because that is how it is experienced, and that is where the damage takes place. So that is why we started with that particular topic. But in this particular roundtable, what we want to do is to zoom out a little bit and to actually start looking at the societal implications and the societal expressions of racism and how it plays out in many different aspects of an individual's life, but also how we, from a more political, societal perspective, can actually start addressing these. And to help me kind of explore this topic further and to help me explore this particular aspect of systemic racism more, I have brought with me three fantastic panelists who will be helping me out today to explore those assets. I'd like to welcome, first of all, Eugène Buldak, who is a member of Volt Netherlands. He is also a serial entrepreneur. He's been setting up a number of companies, and hopefully he'll be able to bring that perspective to the debate. He's been a consultant for private and public sector, focusing on risk management. He's been a trainer on dialogue and also effective collaboration for organizations. And he also supports many Dutch Caribbean NGOs. Eugène, welcome to the panel. And don't forget to unmute yourself, otherwise we don't hear you. I am also brought, I would like to welcome also Lloyd Ogenalmo from Volt France, who is communications lead. And he also, in his professional career, is a communications manager. And he's worked for some leading brands, such as UNICEF. So Lloyd, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Kim.
Bienvenue. And last but not least, and it is very much last but not least, I'd like to also welcome Juliana to the roundtable. Juliana works for ENAR, and for those of you who don't know who ENAR is, it's the European Network Against Racism, one of the leading, if not the leading organization working on these topics at the European level and in the European bubble. And Juliana is coordinating ENAR's policy advocacy strategies. So she is really the spear point of this topic, and I suspect is being solicited left, right, and center as this topic has blown up across the world and in Europe. And I think we're going to be looking very much forward to Juliana's expertise to make sure that we are covering these topics in the right way. Juliana, welcome to the roundtable.
Thank you, Kim. Hi.
So welcome to all three of you. And I wanted to first kind of begin this conversation, in essence, to kind of ask you a little bit kind of, well, how are you feeling, and kind of have things evolved for you with regards to this initial spark, which was George Floyd, of course, but now Europe has reacted to this topic. We've had a roundtable where we explored a little bit how we personally have really experienced a world of emotions, a whirlwind of emotions in particular, and just wanted to kind of check in on you in terms of, from a personal perspective, kind of how things are and kind of what is your perspective on the issue at the moment. Eugène, do you want to get us started?
Okay. Yes. Presently, I feel strengthened that in Europe, and in particular in Holland, where I live, people have raised their voices. They have left their houses to go and demonstrate. There's a lot of things happening on the internet, which I consider positive. Yes, for me as a Black person who is often neglected when I talk about these troubles, these problems that we feel on a daily basis, it gives a sense of, hey, people are starting to notice that we also exist in this country and that we help build this country. So in that sense, positive, and as a strategy, I would like to propose to be optimistic, but racism against Black people has lasted for 4 centuries, and I hope that I will experience some improvements towards recognizing each other on all sides, indifferent of the color of your skin. But I'm afraid I will die before that really has changed when it comes to power, profits, and freedom, because those are the real benefits that non-whites have compared to us. I leave it at that.
Thanks, Jean. And Lloyd, from your perspective, how are you feeling, and what do you think about the situation?
Yeah, I will start by presenting myself. Actually, I was born in Africa, in Gabon, a French-speaking country in Central Africa, and Gabon is actually a country that bordering Congo and Cameroon. And I arrived in France in my late teen years for my studies, and I decided to stay here and live here. So I think I probably have a different perspective than people who were born here, on European soil. I think when we talk about systemic racism, we have to keep in mind that it's a very dizzying subject. So it's necessary to be specific of what we are talking about, what we are meaning when we say systemic racism. And for me, when we talk about that, I think usually people think about racism on moral aspect, or racism produced by individuals. And I think that presentation of the problem is a little bit wrong because if people have racist prejudice, it comes from somewhere, from something. I don't think people are born racist, or people are born with racist prejudice in their head. So these two reasoning lead me to think that when we are talking about systemic racism, what we mean by that is essentially sociological and psychological productions of human cultures, because it takes a lot of time to produce this aspect of culture that people kind of integrate in their behaviors, or in the way they will see people from different culture backgrounds or from different skins of colors. So that will be probably my first take on the issue. I will just say furthermore that I think we cannot probably separate what I just described to the question of power. And by power, I mean in all the different aspects of culture or human societies. So history, economics, politics, art. So that would be my first take on this.
Thanks, Lloyd. And clearly, you decided to pick very small topics for us to unwind. So we'll try to cover some of them during the conversation. We have about 15 minutes. I'm not sure we'll be able to cover everything, but we're definitely going to do our best. And Juliana, again, thank you for the time. Well, before we talk about Enar and how Enar is feeling, how is Juliana feeling, and how are you reacting to everything so far?
Well, I echo a little bit the experience of Loïd. I'm a Black person. I'm also a migrant. I come from the second largest country with Black folks in the world. I come from Brazil, and I'm also a woman. So when you add these intersections all together and you try to understand what is happening to the world now, so the gender struggle, the criminalization of migration, and plus the level of police brutality that we have seen over the last weeks and months, especially under the frame of COVID, has emotionally affected me a lot, not only as an individual, but also as a professional. I think we all, as Black professionals, we face that. We have to carry this at the professional level, like Eugene said, right? Plus at the individual level. So in this context, it was quite overwhelming, and to experience all that, also under COVID, that is also have affected our mental health. So it's an extra layer in our mental stability. But in the other hand, I try to be positive, and I do hope Eugene needs enough to see a positive change, a quick and fast change, because I think it's we never been in a moment of the history where we could really shift things. It's the first time in history in the context of racism where we can talk about it, where we can discuss about it, where we can take the elephant out of the room. It's a pivotal moment in history. And I think this is the message of hope that you have to disseminate. It is a landmark step towards societal change. And this is what I hold, is in this hope that there is an openness, that people hear, people listen. It's beyond of being perfect, but it's a start. And the reason why we are here today on internet with Black folks to talk about it in an easy way, comfortable way, in a safe space, is just another component of change. So I cannot thank you enough, Kim, Eugene, Loïd, for this opportunity to be in a safe space where we can address it and where we can build upon these discussions today.
Thank you, Juliana. And I think indeed, I think even for Volt as a political movement, which is trying to promote an inclusive Europe, which is open to each and every one of us, and where we empower Europeans to influence the political debate and influence the political project of the European Union, absolutely. And I think it's great that we are indeed having this roundtable. And yes, I mean, let's get into more of the conversation in essence. I was struck kind of in the opening remarks, kind of Eugene's remark, that essentially this question of neglect, that this policy in essence has been neglected. And it kind of harked me back, and I was thinking about it at the beginning. So I've been working in the European bubble since 2006. And I remember at that time when, the topic of racism was being broached by the European Union. We were having the discussions around creating the Fundamental Rights Agency. We were having the debate around the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So there was a lot of optimism that we were going to be talking about mainstreaming, all of these different policy fields. And yet here we are in 2020, having a situation in the US, which still has had such a strong echo here in Europe. And I'm curious from all your three perspectives, are you finding that the institutional response to this topic has been sufficient with regards to the particular context of George Floyd? But perhaps also going back to Eugene's question, do you feel that this has indeed been something which hasn't been prioritized and neglected for the last 4 centuries, I think Eugene was proposing, or maybe even less? What do you guys think? Maybe Juliana was the last one to be asked to speak. Maybe this time Juliana can start off the round.
Thank you, Kim. Well, it's a tricky question because if on one hand we want to keep the trust in the institutions, and if on one hand we need to be committed and expect there is going to be an inclusive dialogue and we want to leave the door open, in the other hand, it's very sad to see the responses of the institutions. As you mentioned, since the first time where we decided to talk about racial equality and racial justice in Europe back there in 2000, racism has been framed in the dimension of the individual. So it seems to be an individual problem. It seems to be a problem of how one person discriminates other. And as you mentioned, it has been brushed up and it became a principle rather than an action. So you see the principle of non-discrimination, the principle of equality mainstream across all the policy, but then you come on actions, in action points. You don't see the indicators, you don't see the measures that adapt to tailor-made the responses to racialized communities. So it seems that suddenly Europe has waken up for racism. It seems that racism has started now, and worse, that it was an isolated problem from the US, from Brazil, from other countries in the world, but it was not a problem in Europe. So this denial is already a demonstration of structural racism. When you do not recognize that there is an issue, there is a historical abuse, there is a past, my daughter just entered. There is a past consequences of colonialism in all this. And then what happens is that you have policies that are tailor-made only to address the consequences between the individuals, and they forget the structural aspect, the institutional aspect, and the historical aspect, which are the 4 dimensions of racism. So we focus too much in this identity politics, which is a way to deviate from the main question. So how the society discriminates, how the institution discriminates, how the history is not being addressed as one of the motors, one of the drivers of racism as well. So the way I see the response of the parliament, for example, the EP resolution passed last Friday, is a positive change, is a good step, is a good beginning, but it's not perfect. It was a resolution that was passed, draft and passed within 1 week without a good consultation of civil society. So how can you expect the racialized people who are affected by this resolution can have a voice? There are shortcomings in the resolution, like the question of migrants. We are still facing the question of migration as a problem of external borders. And we are not taking into account the criminalization of migrants is also a structural racism. So there are many examples of that. And today, well, the College of the Commissioners, what can I say? They are doing the job, but I don't expect that 27 white folks, without consulting civil society organizations or without consulting experts that come from racialized community and are from Black-led organizations, can take a good stand in terms of long-term strategies. There is an element missing, which is the problem of representation. How can, again, do policies without bringing the people who are affected by that to the discussions? And the lack of leadership and the lack of representation is, again, structural racism. So we are just running around the tail. And I want to be positive, and I want to see that there will be probably an opportunity to develop, to grow from here, but it's far away of being perfect. And I think it's the time as well where we claim our space. This is the time where we say nothing can be done without us. And that's where we have to be more active. So I will stop there and give the place to the others, because I think as well from the national perspectives and how people in other sectors see the situation is also very interesting.
Thanks, Juliana. And I think there's so many things there which I completely agree with. Having worked in the Brussels bubble for that long, I mean, the number of people which are of our skin color working in this space is minute, to say the least. Volt published on its Facebook page a statistic of 7 MEPs out of 795 who are from a non-white background. So that's less than 1% of the European Parliament. I think we should talk about, we'll talk about political representation, but just to, as an indicator indeed of how even at the heart of the European project, we already have this problem, so let alone in the smaller places. I want to bring Lloyd in on the conversation a little bit, because I do think what's also interesting, of course, in this topic is that there isn't one European answer to the problem. Like everything else in Europe, we have 27 different answers to the problem. And racism is exactly the same. And Lloyd and I were having a conversation, and Eugène as well, actually, before the roundtable started, about how in France, the approach is of course quite different, because there, from a statistical perspective, which is also one of the ways in which you measure how big the problem is, there was a choice to say that we don't collect statistics on racial origins, and that we're not allowed to do so. There are reasons for that, but I'm curious in terms of Lloyd, in terms of how do you think the French approach is actually a good approach, or do you think that actually no, this creates new problems as opposed to resolving the problems that potentially this approach was intended to solve?
I think the question of statistic is actually tricky, as Juliana said, because there are good reason to both parts, to people who think we should have this statistic because it will probably help analyzing the situation of discrimination and social injustices toward people, ethnic minorities. But there's also good reason to the other parts. People would think, because of history of genocide in the 19th centuries, the Nazi regimes, etc. All this history maybe political leaders actually are afraid to open a Pandora box, and I think they actually also preventing the society, because in Europe we have a lot of far right movements that could tomorrow come in power, so they could use laws that were put in place for good reason in a bad way. But I would like to go back to the question, and there's actually a link to my answer to the question Juliana just answered. I think when you ask if the institutional responses have been good, I think yes and no. My answer to that question is yes and no. Why yes? Yes, because I think the European level, in particularly the European Parliament, have done a tremendous work in the past and now to adopt resolutions to which calls on EU institutions, but also national leaders, national states, to actively fight discriminations. The problem is at the national level, and it's usually the same problem with EU institutions, etc. We have 28 national solutions for a problem that could be probably find in common together. And I think I'm quite optimistic. I think our salvation will probably comes from the European level and not for national leaders. I will take one example, and then I will give the Eugène the opportunity to speak to. In France, for example, weeks ago, the press, in the press, they talk about a Facebook group in which we have 8,000 of police officers who were throwing racist insults, racist remarks, and it people like us, like me, directly link that group to police profiling. I mean, there's no reason to not link the two, because if you find a group of police officers, 8,000 is not a little number, actually. So the response, the political response was actually very strong, I think, from our interior minister. We said something like, every word, every racist action or remarks would be punished. But I want to say these are just words, because we as citizens, we know they are not going to suspend 8,000 of police officers. So there's that.
I mean, it highlights a very, very simple kind of problem that we're facing. And then also the reason why many don't report when they have actually are experiencing racism or have experienced a racist act in public. But we know very well that the statistics underreport these information, and here's a reason why that might be the case. Eugène, I don't know if you want to comment on this, and otherwise I will open up another can of worms for us to tackle. So Eugène, feel free to join in on the conversation.
Yes, I would like to address the aspect of data collection. Formally, officially, data is not collected based on race. That's true, at least in Holland, in the Netherlands. But the problem with racism in Holland, and I think in the rest of Europe, is not only tied to stating to what race a certain person or group belongs. Policies are developed and executed based on nationality, if you have two nationalities, and Dutch, for instance, and Algerian, and place of birth. I was born in Curacao. I came into Holland when I was 19 for study reasons. And I know that the following institutions keep record of place of birth and nationalities. All municipalities in Holland do that. Central Bureau of Statistics, Central Planning Bureau, police, schools, because when children are enlisted in schools, they have parents who bring them to schools, and the place of birth of the parents are noted, are written down. So we should step out of the farce, the charade, that everybody in Europe is just registered as citizen. That's bullshit. It's not true. And policies are partly based, and execution of policies is to a large extent based on where do you come from, not what you're contributing to the country. In Holland, we have that case, and some of you might have read about it, the child allowances for people who bring their children to daycare. Parents with double nationalities were singled out and were criminalized starting in 2014. After 6 years, we still don't have a solution. So we should not, as voters, let people close our eyes as to the facts. We should work with the facts. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe we can carry on and dig a bit deeper now. So I think we've covered a little bit the macro level of this particular question. But I think it's useful now to kind of zoom in a little bit. And Juliana mentioned this also at the beginning, that actually one of the issues that we face is that this problem has been looked at through a very specific lens in the past, and that there hasn't been much thought given into the multi-level dimensions that this particular topic raises. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about those different policy fields, in essence, where we think racism is currently playing out, and what we think could be ways to address them. I think we raised the topic of education and the impact that has. I'd be really interested to talk all four of us around also the topic of urban policies and those types of things. I think is a little bit what Eugène is also highlighting, is that whilst you might not have the information that that particular person is Black, we very well know that in the housing market, for example, the last name instead is being used to do precisely the same thing. Or that you actually look at the postal code, so the zip code and the postal code lottery, which essentially, if you come from a certain postcode, you're pretty much guaranteed to be either from a particular ethnic group, or certainly you're particularly guaranteed to have a different kind of attainment level, whether it be education or work. So I'd be curious kind of how you guys feel about that, and whether there are particular policy fields that you think merit perhaps prioritizing if we're thinking about policy responses to the societal expression of systemic racism. Juliana, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the question of data. It's a passion for Black people of color. Why we want data, why we want disaggregated data. It's not any data. It's data disaggregated by race or ethnicity, so on and so forth. It's because if you're not counted, you don't count. If you remain visible, your problem remains invisible. And as Eugene said, exactly, it's perfect, it's brilliant what he said, data is collected every day, but by proxy. So even research, when you do research in the field of racism, we do collect data by proxy, take into account the place of birth of the person, the migrant status, the place of birth of the mother, the name, mm-hmm. Even like any like all the proxies, even sometimes where the person lives, if it's highly concentration of people of color. So the data is collected, but it's not disaggregated to bring a nuance of the manifestations of racism that we are affected. So I want just to echo what Lloyd said and Eugene said, is that like really, we cannot agree more that we cannot tackle racism if we remain visible. Coming back to the question of urban policy, I think it's an interesting approach because, of course, you know, Achille Mbembe and the philosophy on necropolitics. Black bodies, they disturb. So the mobility of Black bodies is something that we need to control. And the necropolitics is exactly like that. It's when you have policies that are intended to control certain Black bodies. And plus, additional to that, you have a structural racism that added to another form of control and peer pressure to the people who are racialized. So the question of how we transit, how we are mobile, how we can walk from one place to the other, has different layers. And when you take into policies, and I hear your question, Kim, and when you ask, where should we put more energy? In which policy we should put more energy? My answer is in all of them, because otherwise we're gonna keep fragmenting policies and fragmenting rights. We need a horizontal approach. We need a holistic approach. We need an intersectional approach. And by intersectionality, it means that we recenter race in the equation of intersectionality. Do not forget that in Europe, we face what we call it in our the question of dispoliticization of intersectionality, because intersectionality in the concept of the critical theory of race in the US was done by Crenshaw and other professors by putting the race on the core of the discussions, understanding the convergence with class and gender. When we transfer that to Europe, we left out race and we bring gender to the core, or expression of gender, or expression of identity, and we single out race. So it's kind of the racial element of intersectionality is just erased, and is erased in a very soft way. Is erased with the quotes, all lives matter. There is only one race, this is the human race. It comes when you cannot use the word race in a German constitution. It comes with the question of laïcité. It comes the question of secularism. We are just erasing the problem of race every time in the history, in a loop. So it's a pity that with intersectionality, our policy were designed to be fragmented and just to give a focus in one certain identity that it remain, we know very well, gender and disability so far. And what this fragmentation creates? It creates a hierarchy of rights and a hierarchy of approaches. So you create a hierarchy of first and second class citizens. And if you're a migrant, third. And if you're undocumented, a fourth one. So all these intersections remain a really holistic approach. So what we have to do is to reshift our mental set and do not get along with these fragmentations of policy and call upon a more holistic approach. So if you have housing, you bring the racial dimension. If you have education, you have the racial dimension. If you have employment, you have the racial. If you have gender, if you have LGBTI, if you have disability, you recenter race. So that's the only reason, that's the only way we can try to find a balance and to redress the past abuses. Don't forget that really it's 2020. So we have 2020 years to be redressed. So, but it's a good start. If you use intersectional approach in policies, then we cover everything.
Thanks a lot, Juliana. And indeed, I was struck kind of one of the things we like to talk about in Europe is we're in a post-racial society, that we don't think about these things anymore. We're past it. So I think you remind us that actually maybe we're not so past it after all, and we might think that we're past it by design. Jeanne, Lloyd, do you guys want to quickly come in, and then I want to segue into another topic, but professors come into this one as well.
In Europe, we tend to state, at least the white people tend to state, oh, USA, that's awful, that's awful. But racism was invented, designed by Europeans. And much later, 200 years later, they colonized the land of the Indians, the Aboriginals. So USA is harsh, I agree. But it sounds like a cover-up here in Europe by the people who invented racism and all those hierarchy of races. And so I think we progressives should be very keen to don't make things that matter in real life disappear in our discussions, because real life counts. And not the framing. The framing is political tricks. And we should be quite keen on what frames are used to let's say, bring the society together and give each and everybody equal chances. That's our goal. That should be our goal.
You're muted, Lloyd. We can't hear you because you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Now you hear me? Yeah. Yes, I was just going to quickly say that, of course, I think there's a very positive aspect of the European models, but there's nothing progressive about ignoring racial disparities. So we kind of still have a long way to go. And of course, overtly racist discriminations are uh, probably more fiercely fight by laws, but the subtle forms of racism is still allowed to exist. So we have to work on that. I was just going to give just one stat that I found when I was reading an article, a political article about the state of racism in Europe. Um, Belgians of African descent are more educated than the country average population. About a third of Belgians are educated to a degree level, while some 60% of Afro-Belgians are, but are 4 more time more likely to be unemployed, according to a report by the United Nations Working Group experts. So for me, it's zero. It's zero.
I'm glad you bring that statistic up, because essentially I wanted to open that particular chapter anyway. So we're going straight into it. One of the interesting reactions that I had following our first roundtable was essentially a question regarding positive discrimination, and whether that was potentially something that we could put in place to actually resolve some of the issues that Lloyd have just mentioned, around the fact that even if we go down the route of education, and often we say education is the way to unlock the social ladder, so to speak, but clearly Lloyd's example shows that it's not necessarily the case. Is positive discrimination the solution? And you often hear the counterexample of, well, that's great. If you put positive discrimination, then the people aren't being selected because of their skills, they're being selected because of their race, and that's not good either. I would find that insulting. So I'd be curious, kind of, how do you guys feel about positive discrimination as a policy tool that potentially could be employed? Or do you think something else should be put in place? Should it be representational quotas, like we're talking about in political, well, particularly, for gender, we've certainly put that in place for boards and for the political representation. Should we be also pushing for something equivalent on the topic of race? Question mark. Eugène, do you want to come into that, or do you want to leave that hot potato for somebody else?
Yes. No. It's revealing that negative discrimination is approved, while positive discrimination is disapproved. It says all. But okay, when statistics in Holland, at least, I think that's European-wide, the same thing. People with income above the poverty level and going up, they tend to carry with them some benefits. They get better health situations because they have money. They have better houses. They can hire people to help their children with school tasks. So income is very important for the development of each and every individual and families. And there are two roads leading to better income for all of us. One is education and access to the labor market. Those are the two venues. In Holland, I'll just rush over some information. I worked 10 years as an operational manager at the Inspectorate of Education. I just stopped last year. We bring out a report on education in the Netherlands and compare it to Europe each and every year. There has been stated since 2009 that the segregation is growing in primary and secondary schools. And when you look at segregation, you have people with lower income, lower educational level of their parents, the quality of schools, the licenses of teachers, absenteeism due to illness by teachers, higher throughput of personnel, teachers leaving schools. All those, that hot pot comes together, and what do you see? There are a high number of pupils in those schools with a migrant background. So there are white children of poor parents also in those schools. So income is very important as a, let's say, an axe to bring about equality in schools. And when it comes to discrimination, positive discrimination, I'm not for that. I would like people in school boards, people who are higher label, that they represent the community and not only be filled by white persons, because they tend to understand people of the same culture, same socialization better. It's understandable. In Curacao, if I were hiring people, I would understand people from Curacao better than people from Ghana, even though both of us are Black. So we should be aware of those differences, those biases that we carry with us, and make our selection team broader and give people equal chance. It's not positive discrimination, it's equal chance at last. I'll leave it at that.
I don't know if I could have said it better myself, Rajat. I mean, Juliana, I know that ENAR, I mean, this is exactly the bread and butter of what ENAR was created to do. I know that these were topics which I was talking to Michael Privot about since 2006. Clearly not much has changed, unfortunately, but you know, I'd love to get your perspective on this, because I think this is exactly what your work is all about, in essence.
Well, if you understand that racism is not only at the individual level, if you understand that the structure discriminates, if you understand that the institution discriminate, if you understand that the history just embellish inequalities and disadvantage, you have to be pro positive action. There is no other way. We do positive actions in many areas, and nobody questions if it's suitable or not. But why in the sector of race? And when you talk about positive action, it's also important that you understand what is positive action. It's like, it's about representation, yes, but it's also about quota in political parties. It's also about quota and representation, quantitative representation in boards. Is about access to goods and services that people would struggle to get. It's like running a marathon. It's like, if you are a white person, you're going to start the marathon with 2 legs. And if you are a Black person, you're going to start the marathon on your knees. So positive action is going to help you to lift up, to be able to run this marathon equally, to get to the same end in the same conditions. So it's not that you are privileged one person to the other. No, you are just giving the person the same opportunities, the same access. Because everything is about, like, again, talking about this politicization of racism in Europe, because we talk about formal equality, and formal equality is exactly like that we think that we're gonna have the same results in the end. That in the end, if you go to school, if you find a job, of course you can buy a house. Of course we won't be discriminated. So this socioeconomic aspect is diluted by a fake interpretation of equality. But what we seek with positive action is substantial equality. So it means that when you can redress this disadvantage and make sure that people can start at the same level, because otherwise they're not going to end in the same way. So, and especially for those who like intersectionality as a buzzword, right? Because intersectionality became the buzzword, the new thing. Well, you cannot be intersectional if you don't accept positive action. It goes beyond the concept and the principle of intersectionality. So, if you are, again, talking about anti-racism as, again, the it thing or the trend thing of the moment, or the hype thing, because we are talking about the aftermath of George Floyd, well, my friend, you cannot be anti-racist if you're not pro positive action. So it needs to be a deeper understanding and a sophisticated understanding of racism, to understand that positive action is not a gift, it's just a must, because otherwise we cannot, it's like you have to walk the walk and talk the talk. So if you don't talk about positive action, oh, my friend, you're not anti-racist. So you have to go for quotas. You have to go for anything that is addressing inequalities.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think a lot of us who've seen all the social media reactions, have seen all these companies who have discovered that they have an anti-racist soul, that we're now indeed expecting some of this kind of concrete actions, as opposed to just a nice letter from the CEO saying how wonderful they are and how caring they are and how they will be doing all kinds of things. And then you're kind of wondering where's the concrete actions, and when's the last time you hired somebody from a Black and ethnic minority background, as one very easy challenge. Lloyd, I don't know. Do you want to come in on this, or do you want me to give you a different question? Because I've got others planned otherwise.
Yeah, I just want to give a quick to complete quickly what Juliana just said. I look at two statistics. There are around 50 million ethnic minorities in Europe. And you can compare that stat to the number of African American in the USA. There's African American in the USA are around 13% of the population, and ethnic minorities in Europe are around 10% of the populations. So you can take all the area that I'm going to list, movies, TV shows, politics, institutional representations in the law system, etc., and etc. You cannot compare, because ethnic minorities in the European Union are totally invisible in all the institutions, and we can actually find example in the USA of public figures from African American background. There's a lot of them today, and in history there have been a lot of them in journalism, in movies, in culture, in politics, etc., and etc. So why the USA are in advance? It's simple. The answer is simple. It's because they have affirmative actions.
Thanks for that. And indeed, perhaps a very clear example where perhaps you have something to learn about the US. I would say that certain member states are a bit better than others with regards to this as well. So if you look at the UK, I think, unfortunately, the departing member state actually sent a number of MEPs to the European Parliament from our skin tones. Whereas I think once they leave, we will have a lot less of that, unfortunately. Well, hopefully, those who are listening to this podcast, hopefully some of them are from the European institutions and from the European political parties, including Volt. We'll try to address that and redress that. The time is ticking, but I wanted to to perhaps ask two questions, but maybe quick fire responses to both of them would be appreciated. The first one is something which I warned Eugène and Lloyd I was going to be asking, is whether is the law the right tool? So is focusing on legal solutions or new laws, anti-discrimination laws, we've had them for actually many years, is it the answer to everything, or do you think we should be thinking about laws plus, and if there are pluses, what would you say are the pluses we should be suggesting, whether as Volt as a political party or any of the other political parties or as movements? So maybe let's start with that question, and I'm curious what you guys all think. I will give you the freedom as to who wants to go with that question first. And then I have another one which we can close with, but it's also a can of worms, so I warn you about that one too. Eugène, you raised your hand.
Yes, when I look at the areas in which the Netherlands is very scores very bad when it comes to racism, those areas are police, the judicial system, education, labor market, real estate, and government agencies. And it's not that these lack of equality is not known, because they are documented by, let's say, universities. They are documented by researchers within government. So we know what we are doing wrong. And then comes the question you posed: how can we as civil society force our parliamentarians and government, those who really make laws in the end, because parliamentarians can come up with a lot of things, but in the end, if the coalition says no, it's no. That's the way it works in Holland. So how can we as people from the civil society become active and show determinacy to bring about those legal changes? And legal changes, not only new laws, but demand execution of the present laws, because there are a lot of laws in our constitution, but also penal laws stating that it is not allowed to discriminate. But people get away with that. Discrimination by race, gender, sexuality, race, country of birth. They walk away because there's lack of acting power. So laws are okay, and we need them, but we need execution of those laws. And I think we are the only ones that can press for that. And by I mean people of color and white people, because white people in this country and in other countries are those that benefit from discrimination. It should be said, and it is. If you look at the marathon winners, to use Juliana's words, they are all whites. No black persons at the finish line, and there's something happening during the track on the track. So laws, okay, but we should press for execution and send ministers home when they don't perform.
Thanks, Eugène. And I want to throw in another question, and I think it was kind of, it brings us back to the beginning, essentially, when we began. And I wanted to really touch base with you all with regards to the intersection of racism, the refugee topic, migration, and then, of course, the fact that actually there are first generation Africans which are present, or people of black origins here, but we also have those who are born, lived, grew up, will die in Europe. Do you think that there's been an unhappy marriage between these different issues and topics, which also perhaps makes this conversation more complicated than it was perhaps in 2006? Or do you think the intersection actually is okay and that people will sufficiently understand the differences between the topics? And maybe Juliana, I mean, I suspect you had to deal with this in and outs in Brussels in the power corridors to get them to understand the difference, but
yeah, well, but it's interesting because just this question has a lot to do with the first one about the justice system and if the law is the answer. Because I want to, so we have another BBC moment. I want to add to what Eugene brilliantly said, is that a law is only useful, first of all, if you have a package of measures, they're going to be aligned and engaged in that regard, because the law alone doesn't do anything. It's just metaphor. It's just frame. Second one, I want to also bring a reflection about what kind of law as well, because I want here to bring the reflection of, again, the critic racial theory as about how a justice system is created and how sentences are applied in accordance to the law. So if a Black person comes to court to say, I'm discriminated against, this right was violated, my fundamental rights are not respected, he's going to be equipped and aligned. If it's a Black man, the setting of rights will be aligned with the setting of rights of a white man. If you're a Black woman, it's going to be aligned to the setting of rights of a white woman. And even sometimes it's going to be aligned from the Black woman compared to the Black man, which we know there are extra layers in this equation. So it requires an abolitional lens to understand that this system is not effective if you don't review and take a real perspective, bringing racial justice for the implementation of the law. Because otherwise, we're going to just duplicate the same system. So for me, again, as you know, Kim, sometimes it's not a problem of developing a legislation or a legal framework, it's how things are implemented. And they are implemented not taking into account the intersection approach and the racial justice element, we are not going anywhere. And coming back to the migration element, well, migration in policies in Europe, again, fragmented. You have a hierarchy of migrants who have more access to the other. Then it comes from the European migrants to the undocumented. So who has the right? Who has access? So again, creating this fragmented approach is, again, structural racism. Criminalization of migrants. Who comes to the border? Who can enter? Who is allowed in the fortress Europe? Not understand the different dimensions of history on migration, of environment on migration, of economy on migration. It's, again, structural racism. You are funding projects to control borders. You are funding programs to incarcerate people, migrants, who are just trying to cross the ocean. This is, again, a policy where you are expecting to protect, but still treating migration from an external point of view instead of an integration point of view. And not taking into as an integration point of view is structural racism. So you have so many different aspects that you can take a look: funding, border control, police violence, ethnic profiling. Who is stop and search? Talking about data statistics that we are sharing here, Loïd shared before. Black folks in the UK are 6 times more stop and search than white folks in the UK. And as Eugene said, UK is very progressive, right? There is a very interesting moment in history of journalism. The same year when the first Black television host retired was the same year that the first Black French hoster entered the television in France. So of course, UK is much more progressive for many elements, but you have to address that. So you are taking the approach of migration is the wrong one since the beginning. We have to again take an abolitional lenses to understand migration and stop criminalizing people. And take into account that if we fragment, we are going to fragment rights as well. And in a way, is also a strategy to put people back. It's also a strategy to distance people from rights and access to service. And this is again creating inequalities. If I create inequality, it's systemic racism. So we are just reproducing the same chain. So for me, I wouldn't see the strategy on racism if you don't have a fully fledged strategy on integration for migrants. So.
Thanks, Juliana. And I think it really, I think your intervention really highlights the complexity, the intersections, the different multiple and the different intersections of the policy fields and potentially how they conflict with one another in terms of their objectives. And also, I'm quite struck by the, in essence, if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it type of thing. And I want to bring Eugène and Lloyd into this conversation as well on that particular aspect. And we have to get close to, but unfortunately, I have to stop talking as well because their time is ticking. But Eugène and Lloyd, we wanted to bring kind of the history and the cultural aspect as well of the topic, and I want to bring that in as kind of our final thoughts. And for those who aren't aware, in Netherlands, we've had quite a long conversation around Zwarte Piet. And I think the Zwarte Piet debate is a really interesting one because it really shows the discomfort we have with the history of colonialism, the history of racism within Europe, and also the fact that how it really, in understanding what's happening today, we have to understand that a lot of what we've been taught in schools, in essence, is in conflict with this idea that, you know, Europe is and always has been the good guy. We've brought civilization and culture to the rest of the world. We had a positive contribution to the world. We had the world wars, and through the world wars, we learned about our mistakes. And now we are in this post-racial society. Europe does not have, you know, a realpolitik in it. It's beyond that. It is the good guy. It is one which will bring human rights to the rest of the world. And then we have this debate in the Netherlands, for example, about Zwarte Piet, which really jars with that vision and that image. And I think that's also why people are so uncomfortable with this topic or uncomfortable with the statues being torn down and that type of thing, because we have this very romanticized version of the European Union and the European project in our history. And I'm curious, Eugène and Lloyd, do you think that this is also why this topic is so emotive on both sides of the arguments? I hesitate to say both sides of the arguments, but from people who react with a lot of discomfort to the rising of the situation.
Yes, so I will go first. Well, I would say that when I heard Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, defending Black Pete, personally, for me, it was like a spit in the face of people like me or who look like me. Even if I'm not Dutch, so I don't actually understand I don't know the exact history of that celebration, but there is a symbolic to seeing white people dressing up as Black people with all these exacerbated face to make fun. I mean, it's a celebration to make fun. So it has a history. And I link that to what Macron said in one of his discourse after the marching about Black Lives Matter. In the same sentence, he was denouncing racism. He said, we are not going to erase our history or tear down any statue. Well, I found this conversation interesting because the question should be, why are people are so angry that they want to tear down statues. And for me, the question is totally legitimate because um, political leaders should take it as an occasion to open a conversation in the society to because each one of us, Black or white, African descent, or other ethnic minorities, we carries a very complex, a very difficult history. And now we are here in Europe. We are supposed to be one nation, indivisible. So the ghosts of the past are coming back. And why these ghosts are coming back? Because uh, I believe one part of history is totally ignored by, I think, the majority of the population. I would just give you one stat, one last stat. I read in the same political article I was talking um, later that before that a quarter of Belgian high school graduates remain unaware that Congo was a Belgian colony. So a quarter of Belgian high school graduates. How um, these people are supposed to understand the presence of a Congolese diaspora in Belgium? They cannot. They cannot link the two because they are totally unaware of that history. Um, they cannot understand why the Congolese diaspora want to tear down every statue of Leopold II because they are totally ignorant of that history. And I actually I've experienced this before because a lot of my friends when I was in schools are totally ignorant of the history of the colonization, the French colonization in Africa particularly. So I have to explain them a lot of things. Why, for example, people always ask me, "Oh, you speak very well French." So I think it is time now uh, to take part of to acknowledge that part of history. It's necessary. It's a necessary conversation, and that's why I was thinking before we start the roundtable that for me the top area is education and culture, because with education and culture we can understand things in a more complex in their complex reality.
Thanks, Lloyd. Eugène, I don't know if you, I see that the time is ticking, so this will be one of the final remarks, but what, how do you?
I'll do it fast.
Super, thanks.
The Dutch call Zwarte Piet our tradition. I was born Dutch 67 years ago because we were a colony, so I'm Dutch longer than most of the Dutch that live nowadays. And traditions come and go. In the past, we used to hunt. Also in the Netherlands, some ages ago, we used to hunt from one area of the country. We would go hunt for women of the other people living next to us. We carried their women back to our communities. That was tradition, a long time ago. We used to discriminate against women even in last century by paying them less. Even today, 2020, we have a tradition of paying women for the same job less than men. That's also a tradition. Those are horrifying things. We discriminate against gay people. That's also horrifying. At the moment, there is thank God, a change in that, but those things can all be called tradition. So naming something tradition doesn't excuse one of thinking about what it does to the people who are suffering from your position of power and hurting them. So, but we have politicians who are not leaders. They walk behind the masses. And if the masses want to discriminate, they say, okay, let the masses solve it. That's the country we are living in Holland. No, we don't have leaders. We have followers of, let's say, racial, how do you call it? Racial bias, which is universal though, but as a leader, you should deal with that. You should not be enforcing that just for electoral purposes. In this country, we had a tradition also, and in Belgium, of taking Africans to Europe and exhibiting them in zoos. That was also a tradition. We don't do that anymore. So Zwarte Piet, it will disappear. We will keep fighting it till it disappears. Just as women and gay people have struggled to be recognized, we will overcome.
Thanks, Eugene. I hesitate having to come to do anything after that because I think it's just a perfect way to close the roundtable. I hope for those of you who have been listening that you found the conversation really interesting. And I want to thank Juliana, Lloyd, and Eugene for contributing to such a rich conversation about, it's quite difficult to cover all of the different policy fields which this actually covers. And I think we've done a pretty good job of touching each and every one of them. I hope you've learned a lot. Again, Juliana works for ENAR, the European Network Against Racism. They issue all kinds of reports about these topics from different angles. And I really, if you're not familiar with their work, I really recommend going to their website because they have a lot of things that can really help you to understand.
I will do that.
The experience of Europeans of African descent, but not just, but to really to understand why the things that are happening today are happening. We've covered, work, we've covered discrimination, we've covered crime, we've covered anti-discrimination laws, we've covered education and culture, we've covered the need for a multi-level, very coherent and comprehensive approach to this particular problem, and that only if we address also the historic nature of this issue can we really overcome this. So this was just the beginning of the conversation. In the next roundtable, which we're going to be hosting on Saturday, our intention is to essentially go from this level of discomfort. I think a lot of those who have been listening are getting goosebumps about what we've been talking about, are really discovering a world that they perhaps weren't aware of. And in the last roundtable, what we want to talk a little bit about is, so how do we address this discomfort and turn it into something constructive, something positive, something which actually will lead to a positive change? So this isn't just the next hashtag discussion, but we actually lead to something which actually is positive change. So I do hope you'll join me on Saturday. Different group of people, but I think they'll be just as enriching as Juliana, Lloyd, and Eugene. Thank you all three of you for joining me this evening. And I wish you a great rest of your day. And again, go check out ENAR's website for more information about what they're up to. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all of you.
Thank you, Kim.
Bye-bye. Bye, Kim.
Everyone.
And thank you to George.